For more than 4 decades, a humble man from rural Kentucky would quietly build a legacy that would ripple through the world of spirituality, metaphysics, and human consciousness in ways no one could have anticipated. Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, was not the kind of figure you might expect to shape the modern conversation on life after death. He was soft-spoken, deeply religious in his Christian faith, and initially reluctant to use his unusual gift. Yet, between 1901 and his passing in 1945, he would conduct over 14,000 documented psychic readings, each one meticulously recorded and preserved. These readings did not come from a place of showmanship or self-promotion. They came while Cayce was in a deep, self-induced trance, his eyes closed, his breathing slow, his voice shifting into a calm, almost otherworldly cadence. From that altered state, he answered questions with a depth, detail, and authority that left even the most skeptical observers struggling to explain what they had just heard. Cayce's gift was not confined to one subject. In his early years, he was often sought for medical diagnoses, offering precise insights into ailments and treatments long before modern imaging technology could confirm them. Over time, the scope of his readings expanded dramatically. He began to speak about the soul, reincarnation, past lives, and spiritual laws that governed human existence. And inevitably, the question arose, the one that has haunted humanity for millennia: what happens when we die? It was in answering this question that Cayce's work would become both revolutionary and unsettling, offering an account of the afterlife that was at once comforting, challenging, and utterly unlike most religious teachings of the time. What set Cayce apart was not just the content of his answers, but the consistency with which he described them. This was not a psychic throwing out vague images open to interpretation. Across thousands of sessions, separated by years, locations, and questioners, the same patterns emerged. When asked about the death process, MPT, whether by a grieving mother desperate to hear from her lost child, or by a philosopher seeking to understand the mechanics of consciousness, Cayce's descriptions of the moments immediately following death rarely wavered. This remarkable consistency became one of the strongest arguments in favor of his authenticity. It also made his work one of the richest bodies of information ever assembled on the subject of what happens when the spirit leaves the body. The method by which Cayce accessed this information was itself mysterious. He would lie down, close his eyes, and allow himself to drift into a deep sleep-like state, a trance in which his ordinary personality seemed to step aside. From there, a different aspect of his consciousness, Ana, what he sometimes referred to as the source, would speak. This source seemed to have access to infinite knowledge, able to retrieve information from the Akashic records, a term Cayce used to describe a kind of universal library containing the history, present, and potential future of every soul. It was from this timeless vantage point that Cayce could observe the passage of a soul from the physical plane into the spiritual dimensions beyond. In the early decades of his work, his accounts of the afterlife were seen as an intriguing but fringe curiosity. Yet, as his fame grew, so did the seriousness with which researchers approached his material. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, ARE, was founded in Virginia Beach during his lifetime, not as a religious institution, but as a center to collect, study, and preserve the readings. Here, stacks of meticulously typed transcripts began to form an unprecedented archive, one that would later reveal a startling picture of the death experience. What emerged was not a simple heaven-hell dichotomy, but a layered, dynamic process of awakening, adjustment, and growth. For Cayce, death was not an abrupt ending, it was a transition, a movement from one dimension of experience into another. The soul did not lose consciousness in the way many imagine. Rather, it retained awareness, but had to gradually adapt to a new mode of existence. This adaptation period was profoundly shaped by the beliefs, attitudes, and spiritual development of the individual during life. He spoke of souls who slipped easily into the afterlife, almost as though stepping through a doorway into a familiar room. Others lingered in confusion, still trying to interact with the physical world, unaware that they had crossed the threshold. The fact that Cayce spoke about this process with such authority gave many pause. These were not speculative ideas cobbled together from religious texts. They were presented as direct observations, consistent across decades, and grounded in a framework that he claimed was universal. Whether speaking in the early 90s in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, or in the later years of his life in Virginia Beach, the details remained strikingly similar. It was as if he was describing a universal law, one as unchanging as gravity, that governed the soul's journey beyond death. Part of what made Cayce's insights so compelling was their humanity. He did not speak of the afterlife as a cold, clinical process, but as a deeply personal journey. He spoke of reunions with loved ones, of the persistence of personality, of the ability to perceive thoughts and emotions in ways we cannot during physical life. But he also spoke of accountability, not in the sense of eternal punishment, but in the form of a life review where the soul comes to see, with perfect clarity, the ripple effects of its choices. By the time of his death in 1945, Cayce had amassed a body of work that would become a cornerstone for those seeking to understand the continuity of consciousness after physical death. His legacy was not without controversy. Critics pointed to the unverifiable nature of some claims, but even they could not dismiss the meticulous documentation and the sheer volume of consistent accounts. Supporters saw him as a bridge between worlds, a rare individual able to articulate the mechanics of the unseen with both precision and compassion. In the decades since his passing, the parallels between Cayce's descriptions and the accounts of modern near-death experiences have been striking. Researchers like Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience, have noted the overlap between contemporary testimonies and what Cayce described decades earlier. The idea of a consciousness that survives death, experiences a transitional period, retains personality, and undergoes a review of life choices is now common in NDE research, DAP, but Cayce was describing it long before such research existed. And so, when we approach the question of what happens after death, we are not entering into a field of pure speculation. We are stepping into an area where a man, working quietly and diligently for more than 40 years, compiled a record that has been studied, cross-referenced, and compared to modern research, and found to hold up with remarkable consistency. This is why the 5 most shocking things Cayce revealed about the moments after death matter so deeply. They are not the product of a single vision, nor a creative imagining meant to comfort or scare. They are the product of thousands of consistent reports, from a man who claimed to see the journey of the soul as clearly as one might watch a sunrise. In the chapters ahead, we will walk through each of these 5 phenomena, not as abstract ideas, but as detailed, interconnected steps in a process that every one of us will one day experience. If Cayce's accounts are correct, they are not just glimpses into the hereafter, they are a mirror reflecting how we live now, and a guide to preparing for the greatest transition of all. It's one of the most haunting revelations to come from Edgar Cayce's thousands of trance state readings series, one that shatters our assumptions about what happens at the moment of death. According to Cayce, dying doesn't feel like dying. In fact, many souls don't even realize it's happened. Consciousness doesn't shut off. It doesn't flicker and vanish like a blown-out candle. Instead, it continues, moving seamlessly from one state to another. But because that continuation is so smooth, so deceptively familiar, many souls remain convinced they are still alive, still tethered to the physical world, still operating under the laws of time and space. And for some, that illusion can linger far longer than we might expect. Cayce's readings describe this moment as one of profound disorientation. The soul slips from the physical body, but awareness remains intact. There is no thunderclap, no dramatic departure scene. Often, the spirit exits so gently, so subtly, that it continues thinking, feeling, and behaving just as it did seconds before. Some try to return to their daily routines, walking into rooms, speaking to loved ones, attending to unfinished business. But something is off. No one responds. Objects don't move. Time doesn't behave quite the same, and slowly, an unsettling realization begins to surface. No, something has changed, something irreversible. This stage is what Cayce referred to as the initial consciousness adjustment period. It is the first of 5 distinct post-death phenomena he consistently documented across decades of readings. And it's by far the most disorienting, because it confronts the soul with a reality it is not yet prepared to face. The awareness is still there, thought continues, emotion continues. The personality remains intact, but the familiar framework of the physical world, 19, the solidity of objects, the linear progression of events, the ability to communicate through speech, is breaking down. And for a soul who clings to the idea that death must be immediate and dramatic, this quiet slipping away comes as a shock. Many souls, according to Cayce, do not leave the physical world instantly or completely. In fact, they hover. They linger near the body, near loved ones, near places of emotional importance. They often attempt to speak, they reach out, they call names, they walk through homes, they sit beside grieving family members, confused as to why they cannot be heard or seen. This isn't ghost story lore. This is, Cayce insisted, a real and natural part of the transition experience, 9, one that happens not because the soul is malicious or lost, but because it does not yet realize it has transitioned at all. The situation is made more complex by the habits the soul carries from physical life. Cayce explained that consciousness is shaped by routine. We are creatures of habit, not just physically but mentally. The way we think, the emotions we cling to, the patterns of thought and reaction we repeat, these don't disappear at the moment of death. They remain embedded in the soul's awareness. So when the body dies, the consciousness continues running those programs. The banker still worries about his accounts, the mother still reaches for her child, the student still prepares for exams, the soldier still looks for danger. These patterns don't shut off simply because the heart has stopped beating. It is this inertia, this continuation of familiar thought and behavior, that creates what Cayce called a consciousness fog. The soul is not stupid, it is not blind, but it is confused. It is navigating a space that looks familiar but feels different. Walls are not quite solid, voices echo strangely, time feels unanchored, and the people the soul loves most seem unaware of its presence. Cayce described this as a stage of fogged awareness, where the soul drifts between dimensions, not fully anchored in the physical or spiritual realms. And depending on the spiritual development of the individual, this fog can lift quickly, or linger for days, weeks, even longer. What determines the length and difficulty of this adjustment, Cayce said, is the level of spiritual awareness cultivated during life. Those who had accepted the reality of the soul, who had meditated on the meaning of death, who had practiced spiritual openness, IIS, they transition with greater ease. For them, the signs are recognized. The veil lifts swiftly. There is no panic, no confusion, just the gentle knowing that a doorway has been crossed and a new chapter has begun. But for others, those steeped in materialism, those who denied the soul, those who resisted the idea of life beyond the body, the fog is thicker. The soul clings to the old world because it does not believe in the new one. Cayce offered powerful examples of this phenomenon. In readings where he was asked to connect with newly deceased individuals, he often reported that the soul was still near the body, or unaware of their passing. He described spirits pacing hospital rooms, lingering in bedrooms, even attending their own funerals with confusion or distress. One particularly moving account described a young man who died in a car accident but continued trying to wake his girlfriend who had survived. He did not know he was dead. His urgency was real, his pain was palpable. And until he could be gently guided to realize the truth, he remained in that loop, trapped not by punishment, but by a lack of awareness. This early stage of post-death experience also explains much about hauntings, according to Cayce. He did not speak of spirits trapped in torment or forced into lingering by external forces. Instead, he described them as souls caught in repetition, nines, still acting out the thoughts and behaviors that defined their earthly identity. In most cases, they were not evil or threatening. They were confused. They were stuck in a fog created not by divine punishment, but by the inertia of unawakened consciousness. But even this fog, Cayce said, serves a purpose. It is not random, it is not cruel, it is part of the soul's gradual adaptation to a new dimension of experience. Just as a child must adjust from womb to world, the soul must adjust from world to spirit, and that takes time. The fog becomes a transitional cocoon, where the soul gently releases its attachment to physical life and prepares to move forward. It is a sacred pause, not a failure, and even in this fog, help is available. According to Cayce, spiritual guides, love beings of higher development, often come to assist souls through this stage. Sometimes it is a loved one who has passed before. Sometimes it is a spiritual teacher or guardian the soul recognizes intuitively. These guides do not force awakening. They nudge, they comfort, they wait. And when the soul is ready, truly ready, to accept its new reality, the fog lifts, the awareness expands, and the next stage of the journey begins. What Cayce emphasized most is that this stage is universal. It does not depend on religion, culture, or belief system. Everyone goes through it, though the length and intensity may vary. It is not a punishment or a reward. It is simply the soul coming to terms with the truth of its new condition. And that truth, while shocking at first, becomes the beginning of a deeper, clearer, more luminous awareness. In this way, Cayce turned the moment of death from a fearful unknown into a richly textured process of awakening. He showed that consciousness survives, that it continues thinking and feeling, and that its first challenge is simply recognizing that the body is no longer its home. This realization is not instantaneous. It is earned through perception, adjustment, and surrender. But once made, it opens the doorway to everything that follows: healing, learning, remembrance, and eventually, the life review. The soul does not die, it awakens. And the shock of that awakening, no shock of realizing that death was not an end, but a transition, is one of the most profound and liberating insights Cayce ever offered. For those willing to understand it, this knowledge changes everything, not just how we face death, but how we live each day leading up to it. Because if the soul keeps walking after the body rests, the way we walk now matters more than we've ever imagined. In the silent hours following physical death, when the body lies still but the spirit has already begun its ascent, something strange and unexpected lingers. According to Edgar Cayce's decades of trance state readings, what remains is not just the soul in its pure spiritual form, but something in between, an echo of the physical, a shadow of sensation that refuses to fade instantly. He called it the etheric body. And in his revelations, this subtle form plays a crucial, often misunderstood role in helping the soul transition from the world of matter into the world of spirit. It is not a ghost, not a hallucination, not an illusion. It is a real, energetic form, woven from memory, emotion, and sensory residue, that bridges the dying process and shapes the early moments of the afterlife. Cayce consistently described the etheric body as the intermediary vehicle of consciousness. It is neither fully material nor fully spiritual. Instead, it functions like a sheath of memory, an energetic mold that once held the soul's experiences within the physical body, and now slowly begins to dissolve as the spirit prepares to move higher. But for a time, this body persists, and in that persistence lies one of the most surprising truths about death. The soul can still feel, not metaphorically, not abstractly. It can feel warmth, cold, pressure, pain, comfort. These sensations are not originating in the dead physical body, no not. They are carried in the etheric template. The spirit is still wearing a coat stitched from sensory memory. This is why Cayce repeatedly emphasized that death is not an instant severing, but a gradual unfurling. The etheric body is part of what allows for that gradualness. Imagine trying to jump from one frequency to another without a bridge. The shock would be disorienting, even traumatic. The etheric body acts as a buffer, a transition layer, gently easing the soul away from the physical world while still letting it process the change. It gives the soul something to wear while it lets go. And during this time, sensations may linger in ways that are both comforting and confusing. Many people imagine that death brings immediate release, instant liberation from physical discomfort, instant disconnection from the body's needs and limitations, but Cayce warned against such assumptions. In his readings, he described souls who reported phantom sensations. A man who died in great pain still felt the tightness in his chest after passing. A woman who had always struggled with cold hands continued to feel chilled for hours in the spirit state. These were not delusions, they were etheric impressions, not caused by nerves or muscles, but by memory, identity, and emotional imprinting. The soul remembers what it lived in the body, and that memory has texture. It's easy to overlook how deeply we identify with our physical sensations until they are no longer biologically active. We think of ourselves as tired, hungry, anxious, or relaxed, yet these states are tied to a body that interprets them. When the body dies, that interpretation doesn't vanish instantly. It echoes through the etheric shell. In this strange middle phase, the soul continues to feel its former state, and if the individual died under stressful, painful, or emotionally chaotic circumstances, that residue can be intense. But it's not punishment, it's part of the process of unwinding, of releasing attachment to the identity the soul once wore like a second skin. This makes the etheric body not just a passive container, but a dynamic participant in the death transition. Cayce taught that the way the soul treated the physical body during life shapes how long and how deeply it remains tethered to the etheric experience after death. A soul that respected its body, that lived in balance, that embraced spiritual truths, moves more smoothly through the dissolution of the etheric layer. But a soul that abused the body, denied the spiritual realm, or clung obsessively to the material world might linger, haunted by sensation, distracted by cravings it can no longer satisfy, confused by feelings it cannot trace to a physical source. In some of his more detailed readings, Cayce described how this lingering sensation affects not only the soul's own awareness, but also its interaction with the physical realm. A spirit still heavily invested in its etheric identity might be drawn back to places, people, or objects that reinforce those sensations, like a favorite chair, a familiar bed, or the scent of a loved one. These are not hauntings in the traditional sense. They are moments of energetic attraction, ridees, fragments of a soul still clothed in memory, still reaching toward what feels familiar. The etheric body, in its impermanence, holds on just long enough to make the spirit's detachment a process, rather than a plunge. But this bridge does eventually dissolve. Cayce made it clear that the etheric body is not meant to last indefinitely. It fades as the soul gains clarity. As the spirit begins to orient itself toward higher frequencies of consciousness, the pull of physical memory loses its grip. The sensations become less frequent, less intense, more dreamlike. Eventually, the soul realizes that it no longer needs that transitional sheath. It steps out of it the way one might step out of a coat after a storm has passed. But the timing of that release is deeply individual. It depends on awareness, on intention, and most of all, on spiritual readiness. What's profound about Cayce's teaching is that he didn't present this stage as negative or something to fear. The etheric body is not a trap, it's a gift. It offers continuity in a moment that could otherwise feel like an abyss. It comforts the soul with enough familiarity to avoid complete shock, while gently introducing the new rules of spiritual existence. It allows for a soft landing, a place between the world we know and the world we're headed toward. And while it can be a place of confusion, it can also be a space of beauty. Cayce described instances where souls experienced warmth, light, or the subtle feeling of floating. These too are etheric impressions, evidence that the body is no longer dragging the soul down with its density, and that the new reality is beginning to shine through. Some souls feel surrounded by familiar voices or soothing music, not as hallucinations, but as energetic patterns that mirror comfort and love. These impressions help the soul loosen its grip on identity as defined by biology and begin to embrace identity as defined by spirit. This teaching has major implications, not only for how we understand death, but for how we live. If the condition of the etheric body after death is shaped by our beliefs, habits, and spiritual openness during life, then every thought, every choice, every attitude becomes part of our death preparation. How we treat our bodies, how we respond to suffering, how we process pain, how we cultivate inner peace, these choices do not disappear when we die. They echo, and for a time, we live within that echo. That is why Cayce's work always pointed back to the present moment. He wasn't just mapping the afterlife for curiosity's sake. He was giving us the tools to live more consciously, so that when the time comes to shed the body, we do so with grace and awareness. So that the etheric phase becomes not a maze of confusion, but a soft whisper reminding us that we are more than flesh, and always have been. Death, as Cayce described it, is not a leap into the unknown. It is a gradual unfolding, and the etheric body, though temporary, is a vital thread in that unfolding, a thread that holds sensation, identity, and memory, just long enough for us to say goodbye to what we were, and hello to what we are becoming. It is the threshold of awareness, the emotional cocoon between two worlds, and it teaches us that the soul remembers what the body felt, not as punishment, but as part of the sacred journey toward greater light. This view of the afterlife replaces fear with understanding. It shows us that even in the moments after death, we are still held, still wrapped in a layer of meaning that honors what we lived. And it reminds us that letting go is a process, one that begins long before death and continues long after, in the quiet spaces between worlds. After the physical body exhales its final breath and the heart no longer beats, most assume the soul simply moves on, to a realm of light, to rest, or to some distant spiritual domain. But Edgar Cayce's readings painted a much more intimate and haunting picture. According to his trance visions, many souls, still cloaked in the fog of unawareness, don't ascend into some far-off heaven immediately. Instead, they do what comes most naturally. They try to go home. They return to the places they knew, the people they loved, and the patterns of life that once defined their identity. It is a tender, often heartbreaking phase, where the spirit, still tethered by memory and emotion, instinctively retraces its steps through the physical world, unseen, unheard, and often confused. Cayce described this stage not as a ghostly haunting, but as a natural outgrowth of consciousness still adjusting to its new reality. When the soul separates from the body, it does not instantly abandon all that it knew. Habits persist, emotional bonds persist, and most of all, the deep gravitational pull of love draws the soul back to the spaces and people it feels it belongs to. For many spirits, there is a compulsion to return to their home, not just the physical structure, but the emotional landscape of familiarity. They drift back into bedrooms, kitchens, favorite chairs, and quiet corners of their lives, believing they are simply resuming what was paused. But nothing responds. The lights do not turn on, the coffee pot does not brew, and the voices they speak to carry on, unaware of the presence beside them. In these moments, the soul often doesn't feel dead, it feels invisible, and that is what makes this phase so emotionally potent. Cayce emphasized that many spirits in this state continue trying to communicate. They reach out to their children, their spouses, their friends. They attempt to intervene, to soothe, to say goodbye. And when their presence goes unnoticed, a deep sense of grief or frustration can set in. Not because they are lost, but because they are still too closely aligned with the physical experience to realize why no one can hear them. Some souls return out of duty. They feel there is something left undone, a conversation not had, a responsibility not fulfilled. A mother may linger near a crib, unwilling to believe her time as a protector has ended. A father may walk the halls of his home, still pacing, still worrying, still planning for a future he no longer belongs to. A soldier might stay near his unit, trying to alert others of danger. These actions are not the result of stubbornness or fear. They are the product of a soul still acting from love, still wearing the emotional armor it built over a lifetime. Death did not strip them of these instincts. It only made them invisible to the world they're still trying to care for. Cayce was clear. This stage varies widely in length and intensity. Some souls pass through it quickly, recognizing their new condition as the strange silence around them grows louder. But others linger. Some for hours, some for days, some, tragically, for much longer. The duration depends not on punishment or karma, but on awareness, to press, on how quickly the soul can come to terms with the reality that the life it knew is no longer accessible in the way it once was. The longer a soul clings to routine, to unfinished business, or to disbelief, the longer it may remain in this in-between state. In numerous readings, Cayce described spirits that tried to help the living. They weren't trapped, they were choosing to stay close. One account detailed a recently deceased grandfather who returned home every evening to sit in his favorite chair by the fireplace. He would watch his family, try to touch their shoulders, even attempt to speak. But with no response, he eventually began to sense the futility of his efforts. The turning point came not through confrontation, but through a moment of peace, when he watched his granddaughter smile, play, and move on. It was then, Cayce said, that the soul began to feel released, no longer needed in the way it believed it was. There is also the matter of energetic residue. Cayce described how places imbued with deep emotional significance often act as magnets for souls in transition. A childhood home, a place of trauma, a wedding venue, or a room where someone spent their final days, all become energetic hotspots. The soul returns not just because of memory, but because the vibration of that space still echoes with the identity it once held. These locations become spiritual mirrors, reflecting back the soul's former life and allowing it to slowly let go. But sometimes, those reflections become traps, keeping the soul circling until it understands that those echoes are no longer its present reality. Cayce was careful to note that this behavior is not malicious. Spirits trying to come home are not trying to haunt, frighten, or invade. They are, in essence, trying to make sense of what has just happened. Imagine waking up in your house, and everyone is acting like you don't exist. Imagine speaking, and no one responds. Reaching out and touching nothing. That is the disorientation many souls face in this stage. It is not terrifying so much as bewildering, and in that bewilderment, they reach for the familiar. This reaching, Cayce taught, often extends to the people they loved most. Souls will follow their family members, attend their funerals, hover near their bedsides. They may try to comfort the grieving, to whisper assurances, to share a final message. Sometimes, Cayce noted, the living sense this presence, a sudden feeling of warmth, the impression of a hand on the shoulder, a familiar scent that lingers for just a moment. These are not coincidences. They are the subtle gestures of spirits still trying to come home, still trying to fulfill love's final obligations before they move on. But movement only comes with realization. The soul must awaken to the truth of its new state before it can transition fully into the next dimension. And here, Cayce explained, spiritual guides often intervene. These are not external judges or enforcers. They are beings of light, loved ones who passed earlier, or higher souls assigned to help gently escort the confused into clarity. They do not drag the spirit away. They wait. They offer presence, reminders, and subtle nudges until the soul begins to see. And once the realization dawns, once the soul understands that it has passed, it no longer needs to return to the kitchen, the bedroom, the porch swing. It lets go, and in doing so, steps forward. This entire stage, impulse to return home, is not failure. It is part of the sacred rhythm of dying. It honors the love we held, the routines we built, the relationships we poured our lives into. Cayce's teachings remind us that the soul is not ripped from life. It weans itself from it. It steps backward before it steps forward. It tries to return not because it is lost, but because it still remembers how deeply it was once anchored in flesh and time. And so, the next time we sense something near, a sudden presence, a dream visitation, a whisper in grief, it may not be imagination. It may be a spirit, still tender in its transition, trying to come home one last time before realizing that it is already on its way to a greater one. In Edgar Cayce's thousands of trance readings about the afterlife, one thread appears with unwavering consistency. The way a soul transitions after death is deeply influenced by its level of spiritual awareness during physical life. According to Cayce, death itself is not a uniform experience. It is as unique and varied as the lives we live. And while the physical body may undergo a similar process for all, the soul's journey beyond that moment is shaped by its readiness, its beliefs, and the degree to which it has prepared itself for the truth of its eternal nature. Some souls pass through the veil like a feather carried by wind, light, open, and ready. Others cling to the ground, weighed down by fear, denial, or an overwhelming attachment to the material world. Cayce's revelations offer a profound challenge to the common assumption that death alone is what awakens the soul to the spiritual realms. For him, awareness is not granted at death, it is cultivated during life. A soul that has spent its earthly time recognizing itself as more than flesh, that has wrestled with meaning, purpose, and the inner self, is better equipped to handle the shock of separation from the physical body. Such a soul does not panic when the heart stops or the breath ceases. Instead, it recognizes the process, it remembers. And in that remembrance, it relaxes, allowing the transition to unfold as it was always meant to. It steps forward rather than clinging back. This is not to say that spiritual awareness guarantees an easy death. Physical circumstances may still be painful or sudden, but the difference lies in the soul's ability to remain centered through the change. Cayce described these souls as moving swiftly through the early stages of death, the disorientation, the lingering attachments, the etheric sensations. They do not become confused about their state. They do not resist the pull of spirit. They feel the fog lift sooner, the emotional ties loosen more gently, and the awareness of their true nature emerge with clarity. To these souls, death feels less like a rupture and more like a return. Much of this grace, Cayce taught, stems from a lifetime spent building spiritual muscles. These are not necessarily religious muscles. In fact, Cayce made clear distinctions between rigid dogma and genuine spiritual understanding. A person may have attended church weekly, recited prayers, and followed religious codes, yet still fear death, still resist the truth of the soul, still see themselves as a body rather than as consciousness. True spiritual awareness, in Cayce's framework, comes from a deeper place, a lived experience of the divine within oneself, a recognition that life is not confined to physical form, and that the soul existed before birth and will continue after death. Such awareness often reveals itself in how a person lives. Do they cultivate compassion? Do they seek inner peace? Do they reflect on life's lessons rather than chasing endless distractions? Do they treat others as fellow travelers on a sacred journey? These daily choices, repeated over years, prepare the soul more effectively for death than any last-minute revelation. Cayce often said that the soul already knows it is eternal. The task of physical life is to help the conscious mind remember what the soul has never forgotten. And when that remembering becomes part of one's life, the death transition is not only smoother, it becomes transformative. But the opposite is equally true, and Cayce did not shy away from describing the difficulties experienced by souls who resisted the spiritual dimension of their being. These are individuals who define themselves entirely by material identity, YRP, by status, possessions, appearance, achievements. To them, the body is the self. Death, therefore, is experienced as an existential crisis. When the body ceases and the senses shut down, there is nothing left for them to hold on to. These souls often fall into confusion, disbelief, and even terror. Cayce described them as heavy spirits, not because they were evil, but because they were still trying to operate from a physical frame of reference in a non-physical dimension. Many of these souls do not immediately understand that they have died. They may continue trying to speak, to move, to interact. When those attempts fail, the confusion deepens. Some may try to return to their homes, as described in earlier chapters. Others retreat inward, overwhelmed by the silence. Cayce warned that for these souls, the etheric sensations, the ghost-like echoes of physical life, may persist longer. They may continue to feel hunger, cold, or discomfort, not because the spirit body truly requires it, but because their consciousness has not yet released the belief that it does. Material attachment also creates emotional tethering. Those who define themselves by their roles, parent, executive, celebrity, provider, often feel unable to move on, especially if they believe their work is unfinished. They cling not just to people, but to identity. And identity, Cayce taught, is one of the last illusions to dissolve after death. The more tightly it is held, the longer it binds. In one reading, he described a wealthy man who had lived in denial of the soul's existence. Upon death, his spirit remained locked in a loop, trying to access his bank records, furious that no one acknowledged him. It took time, and help for him to loosen that grip and begin to recognize himself as more than wealth, more than name. Fear also plays a massive role. Cayce emphasized that souls who feared death often created mental blockages in the afterlife. This fear doesn't vanish upon death. It carries forward, coloring every experience. These souls may hide from guides, avoid the light, or remain in the fog of unawareness far longer than necessary. And tragically, this suffering is self-imposed. There is no punishment being enacted by an external power. The soul simply cannot accept the change, and so it prolongs its own transition. But Cayce was equally clear: no soul remains lost forever. Eventually the pull of spirit, the love of guides, and the soul's innate yearning to evolve always bring it forward. There are other subtle signs of this contrast between prepared and unprepared souls. Cayce noted that spiritually aware individuals often experience dreams or visions before death. I said, visitations from loved ones, glimpses of light, an inner peace that descends even when the body is suffering. Their passing may appear to those around them as serene, their final words often profound or otherworldly. In contrast, those unprepared may resist dying even when their bodies are clearly failing. Their final moments may be marked by fear, struggle, or a desperate clinging to life. These are not judgments, Cayce insisted. They are reflections of inner states carried forward from a lifetime of belief and attention. But there is a message of hope woven into all of this. Spiritual preparation is not reserved for monks, mystics, or scholars. It is available to everyone, regardless of background. It begins with the willingness to see oneself as more than a physical being. It deepens through small, repeated acts of kindness, through introspection, through forgiveness, through seeking connection with something greater. It takes shape in quiet moments of prayer or meditation, in awe at nature, in the desire to serve. These practices build the bridge between life and death, not when we die, but while we live. Cayce's vision of death, therefore, is not grim or frightening. It is revealing. It shows us that how we live prepares the terrain for how we die. And more importantly, it reminds us that it's never too late to begin the work of awakening. Every moment of spiritual reflection, every act of conscious love, clears the path ahead. When the time comes, those who have walked that path intentionally will not be caught in the fog. They will know the light, they will recognize the shift, and they will move through the doorway of death not with fear, but with peace, not because they were never waiting for heaven. They had already begun living in it. When the soul is finally released from the weight and limits of the physical body, it does not fade into unconsciousness or drift into some blank, featureless void. According to Edgar Cayce's extensive readings, what actually happens is quite the opposite. The senses do not disappear, they explode. The moment the soul becomes unbound from matter, it enters a dimension where perception operates on entirely different laws. No longer restricted by the 5 physical senses, the soul begins to see, hear, and feel in ways that would be impossible to comprehend while still encased in a body. In this realm, intuition is no longer a subtle whisper, it becomes the dominant language. Perception is no longer filtered through biology, it is direct, immersive, and often overwhelming. Cayce described this shift as one of the most dramatic and consistent aspects of the afterlife experience. He said that souls experience an expansion of consciousness that feels both natural and astonishing. Suddenly, there is no need for words, because communication happens instantly through thought. There is no need for sight in the way we understand it, because the soul perceives directly through energy and vibration. There are no secrets, no masks, no carefully curated versions of the self. Everything, every thought, every emotion, every intention is felt, known, and revealed. And in this radical clarity, the soul sees not only others, but also itself, with piercing accuracy. One of the most profound revelations Cayce offered was that, after death, the soul no longer interprets reality through the eyes, ears, or skin. Instead, it shifts into what he described as full-spectrum perception, a kind of spiritual radar that picks up everything at once: thoughts, feelings, atmospheres, intentions. This is not metaphorical. In the spiritual realm, the soul does not guess how someone feels, it knows. It does not wonder about another's motives, it perceives them instantly. This hyper-intuitive state creates a new kind of awareness, one where nothing is hidden and everything is interconnected. Cayce explained that during physical life, what we call psychic ability or intuition is just a faint echo of what this expanded perception truly is. In the body, we are shielded from too much sensory input. The density of matter and the constraints of time and space give us structure, but also limitation. We have to interpret, to decode, to listen closely for signals beneath the noise. But once those limitations are gone, the soul experiences everything at once. The layers fall away. The soul, he said, becomes fully awake, no longer dulled by the filters of the physical brain. This awakening is not just external, it is deeply internal. The soul becomes aware not only of its surroundings but of its own true emotional and spiritual condition. Cayce emphasized that this can be both beautiful and difficult. For spiritually prepared souls, the transition into this intuitive realm is like stepping into light with per day. They feel uplifted, connected, and understood. But for those unprepared or unwilling to confront their inner landscape, this perception can be jarring. In life, we often hide from our true feelings, we bury resentment, shame, or fear. We distract ourselves with routine or ambition. But in the spiritual realm, there is no more hiding. The soul is laid bare, not to be judged, but to be understood. This new perception also alters how the soul sees others. In the physical world, we perceive each other through physical cues: clothing, tone of voice, facial expressions, social status. But in the afterlife, none of that matters. The soul sees the essence of others, minus eyes, their light, their shadows, their emotional vibration. It recognizes love, grief, anger, peace, and it responds accordingly. Cayce spoke of souls who could instantly feel the grief of their loved ones on earth, who could sense the prayers being offered for them, who felt pulled toward those still mourning, not by obligation, but by the magnetic force of love itself. In fact, one of the most striking aspects of this intuitive perception is how it deepens the soul's understanding of connection. We often think of relationships as being built through shared time and physical presence, but Cayce revealed that in the spiritual realm, connection is vibrational. Souls recognize one another not by faces or voices, but by frequency. If two souls shared a deep emotional bond in life, they find each other quickly after death because their energies are still attuned. They resonate. They attract each other like magnets in a sea of light. Cayce also described the phenomenon of soul recognition, the ability to perceive the spiritual development, emotional history, and inner truth of another being instantly. This is not based on judgment. It's not hierarchical. It's simply awareness. You know who someone is, not because of what they did in life, but because of the energy they radiate, and that energy cannot be faked. In the physical world, someone may appear kind, composed, or successful, but hide deep insecurity or bitterness. In the spiritual realm, the soul shines or dims according to its true inner state, and others see it, feel it, understand it. This expanded perception also gives the soul a new understanding of time. Cayce explained that in the spiritual realm, time behaves differently. The soul can revisit moments from its past, not as memories, but as lived experiences. It can re-enter a moment, feel what others felt, see the ripple effect of its choices. This is not linear review, it is immersive awareness. And it is part of how the soul learns, grows, and prepares for its next steps. But perhaps the most transformative aspect of this perception is how it affects the soul's understanding of truth. In life, truth is filtered through culture, language, bias, and fear. But in the spiritual realm, truth is felt. It resonates. The soul can feel when something is aligned with divine order, and when it is not. This doesn't make the afterlife a place of rules and doctrines. Rather, it makes it a space of resonance. Souls are naturally drawn to those who share their frequency, and they are repelled by lower vibrations. Growth, then, is not enforced, it is chosen. The soul seeks light because it remembers how it feels to be in harmony with divine energy. Cayce warned that this intuitive environment also brings consequences. In this realm, thoughts are not private. Anger, jealousy, or hatred cannot be hidden behind a smile. Every thought sends out a frequency, and that frequency shapes the soul's surroundings. Souls who dwell on bitterness or fear attract lower dimensional experiences. Those who focus on love, service, or healing rise naturally into more luminous states. This is not punishment or reward, it is spiritual gravity. Like attracts like, awareness magnetizes experience. This is why Cayce urged people to begin cultivating spiritual awareness now, not later, not in crisis, but in everyday life, because the habits of perception we build in the physical world carry over. If we ignore our emotions, deny our intuition, or dismiss the inner voice, we weaken our ability to navigate the intuitive realm after death. But if we practice mindfulness, self-reflection, compassion, and honesty, we strengthen the very senses we will depend on in the afterlife. In many ways, Cayce was preparing us not for death, but for sight, for a kind of seeing that the eyes could never provide. He was urging us to remember that perception is not limited to biology. It is a property of the soul, and when the body is gone, that perception blooms into something breathtaking. In that realm, no one can lie, not even to themselves. And that is not a threat, it is a gift. Because when everything is revealed, when the soul is stripped of illusion, it can finally begin the real work, healing, learning, evolving, and returning to the source from which it came. The soul becomes a mirror to itself and to others, and in that mirror, it begins to understand who and what it really is: light, energy, consciousness, eternal. In the world we know, the one defined by skin, voice, name, and status, our interactions are built around surfaces. We present ourselves through clothing, facial expressions, body language, and carefully chosen words. We wear masks every day, not necessarily with malicious intent, but as a form of protection, strategy, or survival. Some of these masks are subtle: a forced smile, a polite nod, a deflection of emotion. Others are elaborate: careers built on image, identities tied to roles, belief systems reinforced by fear of being exposed. But according to Edgar Cayce's profound readings on life after death, when the soul leaves the body, all of that vanishes, and what remains is a presence that cannot hide. What emerges in the spiritual realm is something Cayce called soul recognition, a perception so immediate, so intimate, and so honest, that every mask, every disguise, every emotional wall simply dissolves. This recognition is not about the face or the body, or any physical marker. The soul does not rely on sight as the body does. It sees through vibration, through essence, through the unmistakable frequency of another's true nature. You do not recognize someone in the afterlife because they look like they did in life. You recognize them because their energy is unmistakable. Cayce described this as the way the soul feels another soul before anything else, a deep knowing, like tuning into a unique resonance. It's not memory that guides the encounter, but a magnetic, spiritual familiarity. In this heightened state, relationships are no longer filtered through confusion, resentment, or fear. They are felt as they truly are. A friend who offered comfort in life is revealed in death as a soul you've journeyed with before. A parent who seemed cold or distant may be recognized as a soul who took on a difficult role to help teach a powerful lesson. A stranger who crossed your path for just a moment may be seen as a kindred spirit you've danced with across lifetimes. These recognitions are not always easy. In fact, Cayce was clear, they can be emotionally overwhelming. When all masks are gone, so is the ability to pretend. If there was unresolved pain between two people in life, that pain remains visible in the afterlife, EMBIs, not as a weapon, but as truth. You cannot hide your resentment, you cannot shield your guilt, and the other soul sees it just as clearly as you do. It's not about accusation or blame, it's about spiritual transparency. Each soul becomes a mirror to the other, reflecting not just what was said or done, but the deeper emotional currents that flowed beneath it. The unspoken thoughts, the hidden grief, the love that was withheld, the forgiveness that was never given. This kind of recognition brings with it a raw, almost unbearable honesty. Cayce described this not as punishment but as sacred confrontation. It is the soul being invited into emotional maturity, DOB, being shown everything it created, both beautiful and broken, and being asked to acknowledge it. You do not suffer at the hands of another in this realm. You suffer in the face of your own truth, and yet, this suffering is laced with compassion. The environment is not one of judgment, but of clarity. It is not an angry voice that confronts you, it is the echo of your own actions, your own energy, played back to you with perfect resonance. One of the most difficult parts of this soul recognition is the confrontation with self. In life, we can rationalize our behaviors, we can blame others, rewrite history, or retreat into distraction. But in the afterlife, none of that works. You see yourself as you truly are, your strengths, your fears, your growth edges, your wounds. Cayce described it as a moment of total emotional nakedness. You feel what others felt in your presence, you see the ripples of your choices, and you come face to face with the patterns that shaped your life. For many souls, this is the most painful and liberating moment they've ever known. And yet, this level of truth is not designed to break the soul. It is designed to heal it, because only when the full truth is visible can real transformation begin. Many souls, Cayce said, experience waves of remorse, not from condemnation, but from the awareness of missed opportunities to love more deeply, forgive more quickly, or live more authentically. They grieve not because they are being punished, but because they now understand what was possible. And this grief is powerful. It softens the soul. It creates a hunger to grow, to evolve, to make amends, not through guilt, but through spiritual yearning. Soul recognition also has another profound effect. It reunites. In this realm, souls that have journeyed together across lifetimes find each other again. Cayce spoke of reunions not just with family and friends from a recent incarnation, but with soul companions from other ages, other roles, other stories. You may recognize someone who was once your child in another life, or your mentor, or even your adversary, and in that moment, the walls of identity fall. You see them not as the role they played, but as the eternal being they are. And more astonishingly, you see your connection, how you shaped each other, challenged each other, loved each other through multiple incarnations. This level of connection often brings deep comfort, especially to souls who carried loneliness or abandonment in life. Cayce emphasized that no soul is ever truly alone. We are part of soul groups, clusters of spirits who incarnate together across time to help each other grow. These soul groups often reunite in the afterlife, drawn by shared vibration, shared lessons, shared evolution. And when they meet again, it is not with sentimentality or nostalgia, but with a sense of homecoming. You know these beings, they know you, and together, you begin to understand the deeper purpose behind your earthly interactions. But the end of masks is not just about reunion, it is about alignment. In the afterlife, there is no space for pretense. The soul aligns with others based on resonance, not desire. You cannot cling to someone if your energies are out of sync. You cannot hide your envy or anger and expect to dwell in the light. Everything is vibrational, everything is transparent. This is not cruelty, it is divine order. It allows souls to sort themselves naturally into environments that support their current state of growth. Those who resonate with peace and love are drawn to higher dimensions. Those still working through pain may remain in lower frequencies, not as punishment, but because that is where their vibration fits. And this vibrational clarity is what guides the soul's continued journey. You are not placed somewhere arbitrarily. You gravitate toward the dimension, the environment, the companions that match your essence. And in that space, you continue your learning. You heal what's broken. You build what was missing. You deepen your understanding of yourself and others. All of this begins with soul recognition, notaji, with the moment you realize there is nothing left to hide. Cayce's message was not just about the mechanics of death, it was about preparing the soul to face itself. He urged people to start the work now, to remove the masks while still alive, to live with emotional honesty, to practice forgiveness, to seek truth within, because what we hide now, we will see later. What we deny in life will become undeniable in death. But the good news is that every act of honesty, every moment of vulnerability, every instance of authentic connection polishes the soul, sharpens its vibration, and prepares it for recognition, not only by others, but by the divine. In the end, seeing the truth is not a punishment, it is a liberation. The soul does not awaken in fear, it awakens in light, and in that light, it sees not only its flaws, but its beauty, not only its mistakes, but its efforts, not only what it failed to do, but what it dared to try. The masks fall, and what remains is something more real, more radiant, and more eternal than we ever imagined. One of the most quietly astonishing revelations in Edgar Cayce's thousands of trance state readings is also one of the most confronting. When you die, you don't become someone else. You don't automatically shed your hang-ups, forget your pain, or ascend into some glowing perfection just because your heart stops beating. According to Cayce, death doesn't transform your essence, none, it reveals it. And the soul that crosses into the afterlife is not a blank slate or a purified version of who you were, but an exact continuation. You are still you, your thoughts, your patterns, your personality, the whole tapestry of your inner world goes with you, and this truth carries profound implications, not only for what happens after we die, but for how we choose to live right now. Cayce was unflinching in his description of this phenomenon. Again and again, across countless sessions, he explained that the soul retains its individual personality after leaving the body. The core of who you are doesn't disappear into some collective consciousness or dissolve into formless light the moment physical life ends. Instead, your attitudes, beliefs, habits, wounds, joys, and ways of seeing the world continue. In some cases, they even become more sharply defined. The soul is not smoothed out or made universally serene by the act of dying. It arrives in the afterlife still shaped by the emotional and mental grooves carved during its time on earth. This means that a person who was kind, curious, and forgiving in life will carry those qualities into the spiritual realm. But it also means that a person who was bitter, fearful, judgmental, or deeply wounded will bring those traits too. The personality is not discarded like the physical body. It is carried forward like a spiritual passport, bearing the marks of every journey, every choice, every unresolved emotion. Death, far from erasing who we are, intensifies it. And for many souls, that realization is both jarring and illuminating. Cayce explained that personality is a structure formed over many lifetimes. It is not merely the product of genetics or environment, it is a complex arrangement of soul-level tendencies that unfold across incarnations. These tendencies may shift slightly from one life to the next, but they follow the soul like echoes, reinforcing certain patterns and challenges until they are healed. In this view, personality is not random. It is the map of a soul's evolutionary progress, and it doesn't stop evolving just because we've crossed into the afterlife. In fact, Cayce said, the work of shaping and refining personality continues long after physical death. 9. Only now, it occurs with greater clarity. That clarity, however, can be difficult. Without the distractions of the physical world, the soul is confronted with the unfiltered truth of its inner landscape. There is no job to hide behind, no schedule to lose yourself in, no body to numb with food or distraction. In the spiritual dimension, your inner state becomes your environment. Your thoughts and emotional patterns are no longer private. They are the very vibrations that shape your experience. If you carried resentment into death, you feel it now with full intensity. If you lived in fear, that fear becomes a fog through which you must navigate. And yet, Cayce never described this as punishment. He described it as revelation. It is the soul being given a chance to truly see itself, and to choose whether to remain in its old patterns or begin the hard but liberating work of change. In one reading, Cayce described a soul who passed with deep guilt over a broken relationship. Even in the afterlife, the soul kept returning to that emotional wound, reliving it, circling around it like a trapped animal. But eventually, with the help of spiritual guides and teachers, the soul began to see the root of the guilt, not just the event itself, but the fear and avoidance that had led to it. In that realization, healing began. And that healing, Cayce said, would prepare the soul for its next stage of growth, whether that meant further development in the spiritual realm or eventual reincarnation. What emerges from these accounts is a powerful truth. You do not escape your emotional baggage by dying, you bring it with you. And in the realm beyond death, where everything is magnified by consciousness, that baggage becomes impossible to ignore. But this is not cause for dread, it is a call to responsibility. It means that the work we do here, the inner healing we pursue, the self-awareness we cultivate, has eternal value. Every time we choose to forgive, every time we face a fear, every time we take a hard look at our own patterns, we are lightening the load we will carry into the afterlife. Cayce was also clear that personality is not fixed, it evolves. The afterlife is not a waiting room or a place of eternal stasis. It is a realm of continued education, continued refinement. Souls continue to confront their unresolved patterns, to grow in understanding, to choose new responses. And because there are no physical distractions, that growth often accelerates. A soul that clung to pride in life may slowly begin to release it. A soul that feared vulnerability may start to open. These shifts don't happen through force. Number these 5, they happen through experience. The soul feels the consequences of its patterns in such direct and undeniable ways that it becomes willing to change. But not all souls are ready right away. Cayce describes souls who remain trapped in loops of fear, control, or self-pity. These souls isolate themselves not by external decree, but by vibrational law. Like attracts like. A soul that radiates fear will gravitate toward lower dimensions, where fear is the dominant vibration. A soul that clings to control will find itself surrounded by other controlling energies. These environments are not punishment. They are mirrors. And it is through living in these mirrors that the soul eventually tires of its own reflection and becomes willing to grow. What makes all of this so important is that it places the power of transformation squarely in our hands. We are not at the mercy of some divine lottery. We do not ascend to bliss or descend to suffering based on arbitrary judgment. We evolve according to the patterns we've created, the lessons we've learned, and the readiness we've cultivated. The personality we develop in life becomes the foundation we build upon after death. And that personality is not a mask, it is the raw material of the soul's continuing evolution. Cayce's teachings on personality continuation also offer comfort. If you have loved someone deeply, if you have known their quirks, their laugh, their stubbornness, their warmth, that soul still exists. That personality is not erased. It lives on, refined perhaps, but still recognizable. Cayce often described encounters between souls in the afterlife, where friends and family members recognized each other not by appearance, but by vibration. The essence of a person, nominize, their humor, their wisdom, their stubborn hope, remains intact, and in that recognition, reunion becomes possible. But even more profoundly, these teachings offer us a mirror. Who are we becoming? What parts of ourselves are we carrying forward, not just into tomorrow, but into eternity? Are we cultivating peace, or are we rehearsing resentment? Are we building a personality that is fluid, open, resilient, or one that is rigid, brittle, and locked in fear? These are not just questions for psychologists or spiritual teachers, these are questions for the soul. Because Cayce's message is clear, the work doesn't stop when we die. If anything, it begins in earnest. You are still you. The version of yourself you are sculpting today is the one you will live with tomorrow, and beyond. There is no escape from self, only the deepening invitation to understand, heal, and grow. And in that journey, personality is not a prison, it is the starting point of evolution. It is the canvas upon which the soul continues to paint, layer after layer, stroke after stroke, towards something more radiant, more honest, and more eternal. According to Edgar Cayce's thousands of trance state readings, death is not a final release from the inner struggles we carry, rather, it is the continuation of the same soul journey, only now without the buffer of the physical body to distract us from ourselves. The idea that the afterlife is simply a place of eternal rest or reward was one that Cayce gently but firmly contradicted. What he described instead was a spiritual environment of intense emotional clarity, where healing, growth, and development do not stop. In fact, for many souls, they begin in earnest. The work continues, and in the realms beyond the veil, that work becomes more immediate, more transparent, and more necessary. Cayce often said that the soul does not magically become wise or whole upon death. Instead, it carries forward every emotional pattern, every unresolved issue, every internal dynamic it had while alive. If you lived with deep fear, that fear remains with you in the next realm. If you clung to guilt, that guilt persists. If you harbored resentment or anger, those energies do not simply vanish when the body stops functioning. They cross with you, because they are not conditions of the body, but imprints on the soul. And the afterlife, far from being a final reward or punishment, becomes a continuation of the very process we resisted or embraced during our physical life. But Cayce's message was not grim. The presence of wounds in the afterlife was not a declaration of eternal suffering, it was a call to healing. In the spiritual realm, souls are met with opportunity after opportunity to grow, to resolve what remains broken, and to find emotional release in ways that were not possible while bound to the limits of time, matter, and ego. There is no suffering imposed from the outside. The pain that exists in the early stages of the afterlife is the soul's own unresolved patterns, reflected back in sharp relief. The difference now is that the soul cannot escape those patterns. There is no job to run to, no substance to numb with, no relationships to use as distractions. In the spiritual dimension, the only thing the soul can see, at least at first, is itself. Cayce described the afterlife as a dimension where emotional energies become the very fabric of experience. The soul exists in a vibrational state, and its surroundings are shaped by the frequencies it emits. A soul filled with regret will perceive its environment through the lens of that regret. A soul dominated by fear will experience the spiritual realm as shadowy or heavy, not because the afterlife is punishing, but because the soul's own vibration colors everything it perceives. But what Cayce emphasized is that this is not a permanent condition, it is simply the starting point. From there, the soul is given every possible support to grow beyond the emotional limitations it carried over from life. Healing is not passive in this dimension. It is not granted like a prize or infused like a miracle. It is a process, a deep, ongoing process of reflection, awareness, and release. Just as in life, the soul must first see its pain clearly. It must be willing to sit with the wounds it tried to bury. Cayce often spoke of this process as one of spiritual education. Souls are not judged, they are taught. They are guided. They are offered mirrors through which to view the truth of what they experienced, how they responded, and what still lingers unresolved. And in this space, growth becomes not only possible, it becomes the natural direction of all things. Much of this healing takes place in the presence of spiritual guides, beings of higher consciousness, who assist souls through their process of understanding. These guides do not reprimand or shame. They do not impose doctrine or demand penance. Instead, they hold a loving space where the soul can come to its own realizations. They gently point out patterns, ask questions, and offer insights that the soul may not have been ready to see in life. And when the soul finally begins to awaken to its own wounds, not in fear, but in honest self-reflection, the healing begins to deepen. One of the most profound ways this healing unfolds is through re-experiencing. Cayce described souls revisiting key moments from their lives, not as static memories, but as immersive emotional environments. The soul feels again the pain it caused others, the love it withheld, the compassion it failed to extend. This is not done to inflict shame, but to awaken empathy. By reliving these moments from a higher state of awareness, the soul begins to understand the deeper emotional consequences of its actions. This understanding becomes the soil in which forgiveness, growth, and maturity can take root. And just as importantly, souls revisit the pain they endured, not only what they inflicted. Cayce described souls being shown the traumas they suffered, the losses they endured, the betrayals they lived through, but now from a perspective that is no longer bound to victimhood. They begin to see the karmic threads, the soul contracts, the larger patterns at play, and through that expanded awareness, what once felt senseless can begin to feel purposeful. Not justified, but transformed. The scars remain, but they no longer define the soul's identity. They become the starting point of a deeper kind of wholeness. This emotional development continues as long as necessary. Some souls move through it quickly, especially those who were already deeply reflective or spiritually aware in life. Others take more time. Cayce never described this process as linear. There is no timeline. Each soul grows at the pace it is ready for, but he was clear that no soul is ever left behind. Even those most trapped in pain, anger, or denial are gently guided forward, sometimes over lifetimes, sometimes through long seasons of spiritual work in the afterlife itself. The universe, in Cayce's view, is patient, and above all, it is merciful. What makes this teaching so powerful is that it offers both accountability and hope. There is no escape from our inner work, but neither is there condemnation for what remains unfinished. The soul is not punished for its wounds. It is offered space to heal them, and that healing, far from being abstract, involves real emotional labor. The soul weeps, the soul remembers, the soul forgives, and the soul learns, not because it is forced to, but because, in the spiritual realm, truth is irresistible. Once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once it is felt, it calls the soul forward with an urgency that nothing in the physical world can replicate. Cayce also described how this process of healing is not done alone. Souls often join with others who are working through similar patterns. These groups become circles of mutual growth, places where souls reflect, share, and evolve together. There is no hierarchy here. Each soul is both student and teacher. Some guide, others receive, but all are bound by the same laws of vibration and love. And as souls begin to rise in frequency, shedding fear, embracing compassion, forgiving self and others, they begin to experience a different quality of afterlife, one not marked by confrontation, but by creativity, joy, and even service. Because eventually, as healing deepens, many souls begin to feel a pull, not just to recover, but to give back. Cayce said that some souls, after completing their healing, choose to return to Earth in new incarnations to continue their evolution. Others choose to remain in the spiritual realm and serve, helping newly arrived souls, acting as guides, teachers, or protectors for the living. These are not mandates, they are callings. And they arise naturally, once the soul has released the weights it carried and remembered what it truly is, not a being defined by wounds, but a spark of the divine learning how to love. The afterlife, then, is not a destination. It is a continuation. It is not the end of the journey. It is the inner room where the deepest work begins. It is the mirror hall of truth, the classroom of compassion, the sanctuary of self-reckoning. And in that space, far beyond the illusions of time and form, the soul is finally free, not just to exist, but to become. According to Edgar Cayce's remarkable readings on the afterlife, death is not the end of learning, it is the expansion of it. The moment the soul transitions out of the body, it enters a realm that is not a final destination, but a dynamic and living space. He tends, a school for the spirit. In this higher domain, education doesn't stop. It deepens, accelerates, and becomes more transparent. Cayce consistently emphasized that the afterlife is not a static paradise, nor is it a mere resting place. It is an environment meticulously designed for the continuation of soul growth, with spiritual teachers, classrooms of consciousness, and opportunities for service that go far beyond anything we experience on earth. The soul, freed from the heaviness of matter, does not float aimlessly in a void, it gets to work. Cayce described these realms as being layered, each one resonating at different vibrational frequencies depending on the development of the soul. Souls do not all enter the same space upon death. They arrive in a dimension aligned with their current level of spiritual maturity. Some enter environments filled with light, learning, and peace. Others remain closer to the earth plane, caught in cycles of emotional residue and unfinished patterns. But no matter the level, every realm has one thing in common: the opportunity to evolve. Evolution, Cayce explained, is the soul's natural impulse. It is drawn toward light, it yearns for truth, and once in the afterlife, that yearning becomes even stronger, because the distractions of the material world are gone. In these spiritual planes, souls are not left to wander alone. One of the most striking and comforting parts of Cayce's teachings was his repeated assertion that spiritual guides and teachers are always present, waiting, assisting, offering wisdom. These are not ethereal abstractions, they are real entities, many of whom have themselves passed through human incarnation and now serve from the other side. These guides meet the soul wherever it is. For some, they appear immediately after death, helping orient the spirit in its new environment. For others, their presence becomes known after the initial fog of transition lifts. These teachers are not intrusive or dogmatic, they are patient and wise. They offer lessons not in the form of lectures, but through reflection, energy, and lived experience. Cayce described the soul's learning in the afterlife as multidimensional. It is not limited to one subject, one path, or one model. The soul may study its own past lives, revisiting the lessons it has learned and the ones it has yet to master. It may enter spaces of healing, working through emotional imprints that still cloud its clarity. Some souls engage in group learning, meeting with other spirits to explore deeper spiritual truths together. These learning spaces are not bound by time or structure. They are formed out of intention, resonance, and shared vibrational purpose. A group of souls may come together to explore forgiveness, or patience, or courage, ideas, experiencing these concepts not as ideas, but as energetic realities they feel, embody, and refine together. And just as important as study is service, Cayce made it clear that as a soul evolves in the afterlife, it often feels called to assist others. This is not an obligation. It is a natural expression of its growth. A healed soul wants to offer healing, a wise soul wants to guide. Many souls choose to assist those who are newly arrived, helping them navigate the early stages of transition. Others remain connected to loved ones still living, offering comfort, protection, or inspiration in subtle, often unseen ways. Cayce spoke of souls who became guardians, whispering guidance to the living, protecting them from harm, or nudging them toward better choices. Some souls take on even broader missions. They may work with spiritual councils, helping coordinate future incarnations. They may participate in planning future lifetimes, not only for themselves but for others in their soul group. Cayce described a kind of spiritual administration, where higher beings help shape the journeys of souls still preparing for physical rebirth. These souls review karmic patterns, soul contracts, and lessons yet to be learned. With the assistance of wise teachers, They carefully select the time, place, and conditions of their next incarnation. Nothing is random. Every detail, family, body, culture, even potential challenges, is chosen with deep purpose, designed to support the soul's growth and evolution. This vision of the afterlife as a school is one of the most empowering aspects of Cayce's teachings. It reframes death not as a cessation, but as a commencement, ata, a graduation into a higher form of understanding. The soul, far from being idle, becomes engaged in meaningful study and purposeful action. The learning is not forced. It flows from a natural hunger within the spirit to expand, to remember more of what it is, and to realign with the divine. Cayce repeatedly said that the soul was made in the image of God, and that the journey of life and death is the process of waking up to that truth. There is also an incredible sense of freedom in this classroom. Learning is not constrained by language, time, or physical effort. The soul learns through experience, vibration, and shared presence. Lessons that might take decades on Earth can be absorbed in moments, but this does not mean growth is instant. Some truths take time to integrate, even in the afterlife, and that time is given. There is no rush, no external pressure. The pace of evolution matches the soul's own readiness, but the direction is always forward. Cayce also spoke about the afterlife classroom as a place of reunion. Many souls find themselves reconnecting with others they've traveled with across lifetimes. These aren't always joyful reunions. Sometimes they bring up old wounds, unresolved tensions, or emotional confrontations. But even these moments are part of the learning. In this realm, souls can finally see each other clearly, stripped of roles and pretense. And from that clarity, deep forgiveness and understanding can emerge. Soul groups use these reunions to heal old patterns, affirm shared missions, and prepare for future lifetimes where they may meet again in different roles, as friends, lovers, parents, rivals. The dynamics may change, but the spiritual bond endures. Another dimension of this learning environment involves the arts of energy and creation. Cayce described advanced souls practicing manifestation, learning to shape environments through thought and emotion. These are not fantasy realms, but training grounds where souls explore how consciousness creates reality. What is imagined becomes real. What is intended becomes experience. These lessons help prepare the soul for more advanced forms of existence, where responsibility for thought and emotion becomes even more crucial. In this way, the afterlife becomes not just a classroom for memory and healing, but for creativity and divine stewardship. For those who wonder about the purpose of life, Cayce's vision offers a compelling answer. We are here to learn how to love, to remember who we are, and to serve others in the process. Death does not interrupt this purpose, it amplifies it. The soul, once free of the body's limitations, engages in the deeper curriculum of its eternal journey. Every lesson builds upon the last. Every act of service strengthens its light. Every incarnation is a chapter, and the afterlife is where the soul reads the pages, discusses them with teachers, and prepares to write the next. This perspective changes everything. It removes the fear that death is an ending. It dissolves the illusion that our struggles are meaningless, and it replaces it with a vision of continuity, growth, and sacred education. We are not lost souls wandering between lives. We are students in a cosmic school, each at our own level, each guided by unseen hands, each given chance after chance to learn the deepest truth, that love is the lesson, and we are here to learn it, give it, become it. And so, beyond the veil, in that luminous classroom of spirit, the work continues, not out of obligation, but out of joy. Souls study, serve, and evolve, not to earn divine favor, but to remember the divine essence they've always carried. Death is not the dismissal bell. It is the doorway into a higher school, where everything we began in life becomes clearer, richer, and more purposeful than we ever imagined. Among all the revelations Edgar Cayce shared about the afterlife, few carry the weight, depth, and transformational power of the Life Review. According to Cayce's trance state readings, shortly after a soul transitions from the physical world, it enters into a sacred moment of reflection unlike anything experienced on Earth. This is not judgment. This is not a courtroom. There are no accusers, no condemning voices, no punishments assigned. Instead, there is clarity, a kind of emotional and spiritual X-ray, a panoramic immersion into one's own life where every action, every word, every thought is re-experienced. But not merely from one's own perspective. The soul feels what others felt. It absorbs the ripple effects of its choices, and in doing so, it awakens to a profound truth: everything mattered. Cayce emphasized that this life review does not unfold with shame or condemnation. Rather, it is guided by what he called the Christ consciousness, is, a divine presence of absolute love and higher truth that surrounds the soul during this intimate process. This is not a figure that judges, but an energy that illuminates. In its presence, the soul cannot lie to itself. It cannot twist the past into comforting half-truths or escape into justification. The review is experienced with total honesty, not because someone forces it to be, but because, in that realm of soul awareness, truth becomes the most natural thing in existence. In the life review, the soul witnesses its entire incarnation, but not as a movie playing on a screen. It steps into each moment. It becomes the observer and the participant, the cause and the effect. It feels the joy it gave others, the uplift of a kind word, the warmth of a loving gesture, the hope offered in a dark moment. But it also feels the pain it caused, the sting of a betrayal, the confusion left in silence, the sadness triggered by indifference. These emotions are not metaphors. The soul truly experiences them, sometimes more vividly than it did in life. The difference now is that it is no longer filtered by ego or defense. The soul sees without distortion, and in that seeing, it begins to understand. Cayce explained that this review is not meant to punish the soul. It is not about condemnation. It is about education. The purpose is to illuminate the consequences of our actions, not just in linear cause and effect, but in vibrational resonance. Every action sends out a wave. Every choice shapes a path, not only for the one who makes it, but for everyone it touches. In this process, the soul begins to see how intimately connected we all are, how a single act of kindness might have altered the entire course of another person's life, or how a harsh word, spoken in haste, may have lodged itself in someone else's heart for years. These realizations don't bring damnation. They bring insight, depth, and the first true steps toward transformation. One of the most startling aspects Cayce revealed about this process is how the soul feels the emotions of others, not abstractly, but directly. If you made someone feel small or afraid, you will feel that fear from their perspective. If you offered compassion, you will experience the comfort it brought them. This empathy is not symbolic, it is immersive. The boundaries between self and other fall away. In that space, the soul realizes that all its interactions were never one-sided. They were always shared experiences, always energetic exchanges. And with that realization comes the understanding that there are no insignificant moments. Every encounter carried weight. Every word planted something. Every silence, every smile, every withdrawal of attention rippled outward in ways the soul could not comprehend at the time. Cayce also explained that the life review helps the soul to reclaim lost pieces of itself. It is not only about what we did to others, it is also about what we did to ourselves. The review includes the times we ignored our intuition, the dreams we abandoned out of fear, the parts of ourselves we betrayed in the name of acceptance or approval. The soul feels the ache of its own neglect, not to wallow in it, but to finally face it, hold it, and begin to heal it. This process restores wholeness. It draws forgotten aspects of the self back into awareness, inviting the soul to reconcile not only with others, but with itself. Importantly, Cayce insisted that the review is held within a field of divine compassion. Even as the soul confronts its most painful truths, it is enveloped in a loving presence that encourages growth, not shame. The Christ consciousness does not condemn. It reminds, it reflects. It holds the soul in a space of safety, where truth can be received without fear. This environment allows the soul to take responsibility without collapsing under guilt. It sees what it did, feels the impact, and then asks the only question that truly matters in the afterlife: What will I do with this now? Because the life review is not the end of the journey, it is a pivotal turning point. From it, the soul decides how to proceed. It may recognize patterns that need further healing. It may see lessons that were not completed. It may choose to remain in the spiritual realm to continue studying and evolving, or it may begin to prepare for another incarnation where it can address unfinished work. None of this is imposed. The soul is not sentenced. It chooses, freely, consciously, guided by the wisdom and longing that arise from having seen itself so clearly. Cayce described this stage as one of the most sacred in the soul's journey. It is a reckoning, yes, but not in the way religion often portrays. It is not an angry voice pronouncing verdicts. It is the soul standing before the mirror of its own vibration and realizing that it is both the sculptor and the sculpture. Every decision, every emotion, every act has shaped what it has become. And now, with this knowledge, it holds the power to shape what comes next. Many souls, Cayce said, feel deep sorrow during the review, not out of despair, but from the recognition of missed opportunities to love, to forgive, to show up more fully. But just as often, souls feel tremendous joy. They see how their quiet acts of kindness, perhaps unnoticed during life, created ripples of healing in others. They see how their endurance during suffering inspired others to carry on. They see that the love they gave mattered more than they ever knew. The review reveals not only our darkness, but our light. It reminds us of who we are at our best and why we came to earth in the first place. And perhaps the most profound realization that arises in the life review is this: no one is keeping score, but the soul itself. There is no angry deity weighing sins on a scale. There is only the soul's own yearning to become more loving, more conscious, more whole. The review exists not to define us, but to awaken us. It shows us that we are not condemned by our past, but invited to grow from it, and that growth is the soul's greatest joy. Cayce's vision of the life review removes the fear of judgment and replaces it with a sacred responsibility. We are not being watched from above, we are being seen from within. Every choice we make is a note in the melody of our life, and at the end of each life, we will hear the song in full. The dissonance will be there, but so will the harmony. And from that music, we will understand what we must do next, not to be worthy of love, but because we already are. And now, finally, we remember. ChatGPT said, Edgar Cayce's insights into the afterlife are filled with nuance, compassion, and a consistent refusal to lean into fear-based dogma. Nowhere is this more evident than in his descriptions of the force that guides the life review. Nomen of the soul, freshly freed from the body, stands before the full tapestry of its lived experience. Cayce never spoke of a throne, a courtroom, or an external God pointing a finger. He spoke instead of the presence of the Christ consciousness, Willah, a radiant, loving intelligence that does not judge, punish, or demand repentance, but instead holds the soul in complete truth and mercy. For Cayce, this presence was not a religious symbol or a historical figure alone, but a universal force that existed at the center of all creation. It was the divine blueprint of awareness, truth, and unconditional love. In the presence of the Christ consciousness, Cayce said, the soul is seen exactly as it is, without distortion, without mask, without excuse, but it is also held in a love so vast, so understanding, and so utterly patient that even the most painful revelations become invitations to grow rather than causes for shame. This light does not burn, it illuminates. It does not accuse, it reveals. And in that light, the soul cannot lie, not because it is forced to confess, but because there is no need to hide, there is no threat, no punishment. Only the soul, its story, and the loving truth that now surrounds it like an atmosphere. Cayce often emphasized that this consciousness was not limited to Christianity as a tradition or to Jesus as a historical person, although he recognized Jesus as the highest human embodiment of this energy. The Christ consciousness, as he described it, transcended all doctrines. It was the pure, unfiltered essence of divine awareness, available to all souls, of all faiths, and none It was the intelligent fabric of divine love that permeates the universe, and it meets every soul upon death, not as a gatekeeper, but as a guide. In that moment of radical clarity during the life review, it is this presence that helps the soul understand its choices, not from a place of ego or shame, but from the standpoint of spiritual growth. What makes this presence so transformational is not just its light, but the quality of love that radiates from it. Cayce described it as absolute. There is no anger in it, no disappointment, no moral superiority, just a depth of love so complete that it disarms all the soul's defenses. In life, we often fear being truly seen because we associate truth with rejection. But in the presence of the Christ consciousness, the soul learns that to be fully seen is not to be condemned, decided, it is to be deeply understood. And from that understanding comes a kind of freedom that cannot be achieved any other way. As the soul begins to re-experience its life, joys, the missteps, the missed opportunities, the love it gave and withheld, it does so in the company of this presence. And this companionship is essential. Without it, the emotional intensity of the review could be unbearable. But held in this consciousness, the soul is anchored. It is given a steady ground from which to feel everything, and yet not collapse. The Christ consciousness acts like a spiritual midwife, helping the soul birth its own awareness gently, with compassion, with truth, and with purpose. It is not there to criticize, but to reflect. Not to condemn, but to support the soul's innate desire to evolve. Cayce made it clear that this consciousness is not external to the soul, it is also within it. Every human being carries a spark of this presence, even if they never recognize it. And while the Christ consciousness meets the soul in full after death, its whispers are always available in life. The intuition that guides us to kindness, the inner voice that stirs us to compassion, the ache we feel when we hurt someone, these are the echoes of that presence within. In the afterlife, those echoes become a voice, and that voice becomes a presence, and that presence becomes everything. The soul realizes that it was never alone, that it was always being seen, always being loved, and that the path of growth it now walks was never punishment. It was always the journey back to that love. This realization often brings souls to tears, not tears of sorrow alone, but tears of remembrance. To stand in the presence of such love and know that it never left you, not for a second, even when you ignored it, denied it, or acted against its call, that is overwhelming. And yet, Cayce insisted, this is not sentimental fantasy, it is the core truth of existence. Divine love does not withdraw, it does not retaliate, it waits, it holds, it surrounds. And when the soul is finally ready to face itself, it finds that it has always been wrapped in the arms of this eternal presence, waiting only for the moment when awareness returns. In this way, the Christ consciousness is not a judge, it is a mirror. But it is a mirror of divine light, one that reflects not only what the soul has done, but who the soul truly is beneath all the confusion, pain, and forgetting. It shows the soul its wounds, yes, but it also shows its beauty. It reflects the courage behind difficult choices, the tenderness behind quiet acts of kindness, the strength it took to survive sorrow. The soul sees not just its failures, but its efforts, not just what went wrong, but how much it longed to do what was right. And in that mirror, the soul begins to forgive itself, not from ego, but from truth, because now, finally, it sees itself through the eyes of love. This forgiveness is not abstract, it is the beginning of transformation. Once the soul has faced its life in the light of the Christ consciousness, it begins to feel a new longing, not for escape or reward, but for growth. It wants to do better, it wants to love more fully, it wants to understand more deeply. And this longing becomes the seed of the soul's next steps, whether that means more healing in the spiritual realm, or the preparation for another incarnation where those lessons can be practiced in new forms. Cayce emphasized that this process is different for everyone. Some souls pass through their life review quickly, ready to integrate what they've learned. Others take more time, revisiting certain events, sitting with difficult emotions, allowing understanding to unfold layer by layer. But no matter the pace, the Christ consciousness remains. It does not hurry, it does not demand, it waits with perfect patience, always ready to reflect more, to offer deeper insight, to embrace whatever stage the soul has reached. There is no pressure, only love. This vision of divine accompaniment changes everything. It transforms the idea of death from a fearful reckoning into a sacred reunion. It shows us that we are not thrown into the afterlife to be measured and discarded. We are met, guided, and loved into self-awareness. And in that awareness, we are empowered to choose what comes next. Cayce's message was not that life ends in judgment, but that it culminates in reflection, guided by the highest possible expression of truth and love. And perhaps the most radical truth of all is this: we don't have to wait until death to enter that presence. The Christ consciousness is not confined to the afterlife. It is with us now, always whispering, always guiding, always available when we quiet ourselves enough to listen. Every moment of forgiveness, every act of love, every courageous choice to tell the truth or to heal rather than harm brings us closer to it. And in doing so, we begin to prepare, not for death, but for the sacred review that awaits us, where we will see who we really are, and be held, through all of it, in a love we cannot yet imagine. If everything Edgar Cayce revealed is true, 1919, if the soul continues after death, if personality persists, if we enter a realm where we see and feel the full truth of how we lived, then the question is no longer just, what happens when we die? The real question becomes, what are we doing while we're still alive? This isn't about fear, it's not about living a perfect life or trying to score spiritual points, it's about awareness. Because if death is simply a continuation of who we are, then what we carry into that transition, the patterns, emotions, beliefs, and intentions, matters more than most people dare to admit. Cayce's insights were not given to scare people into submission or to push them into dogma. He was not interested in religious control or emotional manipulation. His readings were gentle but unflinching mirrors, reminding people that life itself is the preparation for what comes next. And the choices we make, the habits we cultivate, the attitudes we carry, all of it becomes the material we will work with when we step beyond the veil. Every moment here is not only shaping our physical reality but forming the energetic framework of our soul. That means what we do now, not someday, not after retirement, not when we're in crisis, but now, is the foundation we will stand on after death. This isn't about being morally perfect. Cayce never said that. It's not about never making mistakes, never feeling anger, never getting lost. We all stumble, we all have regrets. What matters is how we respond to those moments. Do we use them as wake-up calls, or do we bury them? Do we avoid the discomfort of our inner world, or do we sit with it long enough to learn? Because every pattern we ignore, every piece of ourselves we refuse to examine, follows us, not to be held against us, but to be worked through, either now, with awareness and intention, or later, in a realm where there's no escape from emotional truth. Cayce was clear. The spiritual work we avoid now becomes the homework we face after death. The grudges we hold become the lessons we must revisit. The bitterness we feed becomes the fog that surrounds us in the afterlife. But the forgiveness we offer now becomes light. The compassion we extend becomes grace. The courage to face our wounds becomes clarity. And that clarity helps us cross over with more peace, more ease, and more readiness for the beautiful, challenging journey beyond this life. Beliefs play a massive role in this preparation, not because belief alone shapes reality, but because belief shapes perception. If you've spent your life believing that death is the end, that the soul isn't real, that only the material world matters, then the moment of transition can be deeply disorienting. The soul doesn't suddenly vanish because you didn't believe in it. It awakens confused, uncertain, still clinging to old assumptions that no longer apply. Cayce described how some souls linger in that fog, trying to operate under laws that no longer govern their existence. They try to walk, to talk, to pick up where they left off, but nothing responds. And it takes time, sometimes a long time, for those souls to let go of their attachments and awaken to a new truth. But those who have reflected on the soul during life, who have opened themselves to the idea that they are more than a body, more than a name, more than a role, they are able to transition more peacefully. For them, the shift is familiar, not alien. They recognize the sensations. They remember that this, too, is part of the journey. Their belief has primed their perception, and perception becomes everything in the spiritual dimension. You don't need to subscribe to a specific religion to prepare. You need to be honest. You need to look inward. You need to start living as though the soul is real, because it is. And if the soul is real, then every relationship becomes sacred. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to grow or to regress. Cayce's teachings repeatedly emphasized that the soul learns primarily through relationships, not in isolation, not in monasteries, but in the daily, messy, beautiful work of loving others. Your partner, your parent, your friend, your child, your co-worker, these are not random people. They are soul companions, many of whom you've likely known across lifetimes. The way you treat them now, the way you respond to conflict, the way you handle forgiveness or boundaries, these are the soul-level choices that determine your growth. It's easy to forget this in the busyness of life. Bills, routines, obligations, stress, SIS, they can all make us feel like our deeper selves are on pause, waiting for the right time to be more spiritual, more loving, more whole. But the truth is, there is no later. Every moment is the right time. Every day is sacred curriculum. If we wait for a crisis to begin our inner work, we've already delayed the very reason we came to Earth in the first place. Cayce's readings also challenge us to examine our habits, not just the obvious ones, food, substances, distractions, but the more subtle habits of thought and feeling. Do you dwell in worry? Do you feed anger? Do you avoid vulnerability? Do you criticize more than you create? These habits don't disappear at death. They echo. They form the tone of your consciousness. And after death, when all the filters are gone, that tone becomes the atmosphere you live in. That doesn't mean you must be perfect now, but it means you must become conscious now. You must start noticing what you repeat, what you reinforce, and what you could begin to change. The goal isn't to become saintly. The goal is to become aware. Because once you're aware, you begin to choose differently. You stop reacting out of habit and start responding out of wisdom. You forgive faster, you speak more truthfully, you love more openly, and you begin to align with the very energy that will meet you at death, the Christ consciousness, the divine mirror that holds your entire being in love and shows you who you are. The more familiar you are with that presence now, the less afraid you'll be when it greets you later, because it's not a stranger, it's the light that's been within you the whole time. Cayce's message wasn't about fear of death, it was about preparation for life beyond this one, and that preparation starts here. It starts in the hard conversations, in the willingness to say sorry, in the courage to let go of old pain, in the decision to take your inner world seriously. It starts when you begin to live as though your thoughts matter, your energy matters, your soul matters, because they do. You're not just living for this lifetime. You're building the foundation for the next stage of your evolution. Every act of consciousness now becomes a stepping stone later. Every act of unconsciousness becomes a lesson that will have to be revisited. This isn't about pressure. It's about power. You have the power to shape your future, both here and beyond. You are not a victim of fate. You are not a passive player. You are a soul in motion, growing, evolving, remembering. And the more you step into that truth now, the more graceful your transition will be when the body is no longer your home. You'll wake up on the other side, not lost, but ready, not confused, but centered, not afraid, but filled with the quiet knowing that you lived with intention, not seven. And now, that intention continues. Because the work never ends, the learning never stops, and the soul never dies. It remembers, it reflects, and it carries forward everything you gave it. So give it truth, give it love. Give it the gift of your attention. Not someday, now. Because now is the only moment that matters. Now is the only time the soul can evolve, and everything that happens after this life begins with what you choose to do with this one. In all of Edgar Cayce's readings on death, the soul, and the afterlife, a single truth rises again and again, not as a warning, not as a mystery, but as a quiet, powerful reassurance. Death is not the end. It never was. It is not a fall into darkness, not a severing of self, not a punishment, nor even an escape. Death, Cayce revealed, is a continuation. It is a movement, a release from one form, so the soul can step more fully into another. It is not the closing of a door, it is the opening of one. And what lies beyond it is not terrifying oblivion, but the deepest kind of remembering who you really are. This was Cayce's most comforting and revolutionary message. In a world often paralyzed by the fear of death, where so many try to avoid it, deny it, delay it, he spoke of it with calm certainty. Not because he theorized about it, but because he described what he consistently saw in thousands of psychic readings. Souls crossing the veil, not disappearing into nothing, but arriving into something far more real than what they left behind. They awakened, they became aware, they learned, healed, reflected, and continued. He never spoke of a final resting place, because rest is not the soul's highest goal. Growth is, expansion is, reunion with the divine is, and death, in his view, is not the finale of that journey, but one more essential step forward. To understand this is to change the way we live, because if death is not the end, then life is not a desperate race against time. If the soul does not vanish, then everything we do here echoes forward. Not in fear, but in meaning. Every moment becomes richer, every choice becomes a part of a much larger evolution. We are not here to perfect ourselves before we die, we are here to practice, to explore, to awaken. Cayce never said this life was the only one. He often spoke of reincarnation, of souls choosing to return in new bodies, new circumstances, new challenges. And not as punishment, but as opportunity. Because every life, every death, every transition is part of a much longer, more compassionate story than we have been told. When we die, we don't evaporate into light and lose all sense of self. We carry with us our essence, our personality, our desires, our emotional patterns, and we meet them again in the next phase of being, not to be judged, but to be understood. We see what we have created with our thoughts and actions. We feel the impact of our choices, both beautiful and difficult, but always, we are met with the presence of love. Cayce described that love not as an abstract force, but as a living, intelligent field of awareness, Cayce, the Christ consciousness, Cayce, that holds the soul as it reflects, remembers, and realigns. And after that reflection, the soul doesn't just linger in eternity, staring back at what it was. It moves forward. Some choose to continue their growth in the spiritual realms, learning with guides, assisting others, preparing for deeper levels of service. Others choose to return to earth, to re-enter physical life, and take up the lessons they could not complete before. Sometimes they do so to resolve karma. Other times they return simply out of love, a desire to help, to uplift, to awaken others. There is no one path, but the current that runs beneath all of it is movement, evolution. The soul is never static, it is always becoming. This is what Cayce called the divine law of growth, and it is not dependent on belief. It is not reserved for one religion, one tradition, one doctrine. It is the law that governs the universe itself. All souls, no matter where they begin, are moving toward greater awareness, greater love, greater union with the divine. There is no soul so lost that it cannot find its way home. There is no mistake so great that it cannot be understood, forgiven, and used as fuel for transformation. And there is no death so final that it can stop the soul's unfolding journey. For those who fear death, Cayce's words are a balm. They replace dread with curiosity, finality with purpose. He spoke of death as a doorway, one zaro, and of the afterlife as a vibrant realm of activity, healing, relationship, and wisdom. In his readings, death was not an ending, but a shift. A lifting of the veil, a moment when the soul, long entangled in the heaviness of matter, finally remembers itself as eternal, as free, and perhaps most importantly, as loved. That love is not something we must earn. It is something we come from, something we return to, something that has never left us, no matter how lost or broken we have felt. In the afterlife, when the soul undergoes its review, when it feels the emotions of those it has affected, when it sees its light and its shadow with radical honesty, it does so surrounded by this unshakable love. A love that does not turn away when we see our flaws, a love that rejoices when we learn, a love that reminds us, you are not your pain, you are not your mistakes, you are a soul learning how to remember the divine within you. This perspective has profound consequences for how we treat each other here and now. Because if every soul we meet is on the same journey, if every life is sacred, every death a beginning, every person a fellow traveler, then our actions carry incredible spiritual weight. How we speak, how we listen, how we love, it all ripples into eternity. Not because we will be punished, but because we will one day see those ripples with perfect clarity. And when we do, we will want to have lived in a way that reflects the truth, that we are all part of one vast, evolving soul family, and that our choices either help or hinder that collective awakening. Cayce's greatest gift was to remove the veil of fear from death and replace it with a deeper kind of reverence. He reminded us that death is not an enemy, it is a homecoming. Not a tragic ending, but a sacred step in a much longer, more beautiful process. And knowing that, we can begin to live differently, not from panic, but from peace, not from numbness, but from meaning. We can live with a clearer sense of why we're here, not to hoard, compete, or perfect ourselves, but to grow in love, to forgive bravely, to remember our spiritual identity, and to serve from that place of truth. If death is just the beginning, then this life is not something to be clung to in fear. It is a precious chapter in an eternal story, a chance to practice who we want to be, a chance to love more deeply, live more consciously, and prepare, not for an end, but for a transformation into the next level of learning. We do not have to dread what comes next, we have to prepare for it, and we prepare not with fear, but with presence. Because everything we do now echoes forward. Every choice becomes part of the soul's eternal education, and when the time comes to cross over, we will not be erased, we will not be judged. We will be seen, held, and invited to remember. We will step into the loving light not as strangers, but as souls returning to the place we have never truly left. Cayce's legacy is not just about the mystery of what happens after we die, it is about the sacred invitation to live fully while we're still here. To live with love, with intention, with reverence for the soul within ourselves and in everyone we meet. Because death is not the final word. It's the beginning of another sentence in a story that never ends, a story written by the soul, unfolding through time and beyond it, always returning to its source. And so, with this knowledge, may you live not in fear of the end, but in joyful preparation for what comes next. For in the end, there is no end. Only awakening, only becoming, only the soul, eternal and whole, rising again into the light it has always known.